I will now present the known facts concerning the August 7th shooting. The details of this shooting were provided by police officers who were either involved or witnessed the shooting and electronic police records. No video evidence of the shooting is available to our knowledge. At approximately 1:06 a.m., officers were dispatched to a business located at 4720 South Collins Street. At approximately 1:10 a.m., two officers arrived and quickly determined that the location was an auto body shop and not the dealership described in the 911 call. At approximately 1:12 a.m., the correct offense location was updated to 1400 East I-20. The initial response included 6 officers who arrived in 5 marked patrol units. Officer Miller and his field training officer, Corporal Dale Wiggins, arrived in the same patrol unit. At approximately 1:13 a.m., officers were advised that Mr. Taylor had crashed through the gate of the dealership. At approximately 1:15 a.m., one officer found the gate at the north end of the property slightly open and the lock on the ground. At approximately 1:17 a.m., the other 5 officers arrived at various points around the east of the main showroom building. Multiple responding officers spotted Mr. Taylor in the building from their respective vantage points. The officer that found the gate open approached the showroom building from the north. Mr. Taylor and the officer met, separated by a locked glass door. The officer spotted a bulge in Mr. Taylor's short pockets. Mr. Taylor held up a set of car keys and told the officer that he was going to steal a car. The officer instructed him to get on the ground. Mr. Taylor said no and attempted to open the locked door that separated he from the officer. At approximately 1:18 a.m., officers determined someone needed to establish a perimeter on the west side of the building. Officer Miller and Corporal Wiggins moved along the north portion of the building to take this position. At this point, they passed where the officer who was previously talking to Mr. Taylor stood. Corporal Wiggins momentarily stopped with this officer who was verbally engaged with Mr. Taylor through the glass door, while Officer Miller continued westward. Officer Miller found where Mr. Taylor had crashed his vehicle through the glass door. Officer Miller entered the location alone through the broken glass door. Officer Miller first saw Mr. Taylor at the front of the business and began to give commands. Mr. Taylor ran away from Officer Miller toward the southwest portion of the building to a locked door. At this location, Mr. Taylor began lunging his body into the glass door multiple times in an effort to break the glass. One officer on the exterior of the building saw this and reported that the glass wall was visibly shaken from the force of impact. Officer Miller followed Mr. Taylor into the southeast portion of the building and gave him instructions to get on the ground. Mr. Taylor turns towards Officer Miller and begins to rapidly approach the officer while cursing. Corporal Wiggins entered the building at this time while Officer Miller addressed Mr. Taylor in the rear of the building. Officer Miller retreated while giving commands to Mr. Taylor. When Corporal Wiggins saw Officer Miller was standing in a stationary position and Mr. Taylor was actively advancing towards Officer Miller. Corporal Wiggins positioned himself near Officer Miller, saw Mr. Taylor quickly approaching Officer Miller, assessed the threat, and removed his taser from his holster. At that point, Corporal Wiggins heard a pop and told investigators he believed Officer Miller had fired his taser. The pop heard by Corporal Wiggins was Officer Miller discharging his duty weapon the first time. Corporal Wiggins then discharged his taser because Mr. Taylor continued to advance towards Officer Miller. Officer Miller subsequently fired 3 additional times. At approximately 1:19 a.m., officers report on the radio that shots were fired. An additional fact that is important to know, there was no physical contact between Mr. Taylor and officers. Based on these facts, we will be proceeding with the following course of action. Criminal investigators will proceed working through the unmet investigative tasks. Those tasks include additional evidentiary reports such as the autopsy report, ballistic and toxicology reports, which are all necessary and should be considered in the criminal case. Once this investigative work is complete, all necessary evidentiary reports will be submitted to the Tarrant County District Attorney for consideration and for submission to the grand jury. The grand jury will decide if the use of force in this incident rises to the level of criminal prosecution.